بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد. مرحبا بكم أيها الإخوة والأخوات، حياكم الله وبياكم. نسأل الله عز وجل أن يجعل هذا مجلسا مباركا وأن يرزقنا بالعلم والعمل الصالح، آمين يا رب العالمين. وبعد. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to our second session for the course Tuhfat al-Atfaal, an explanation of the poem in the English language. Alhamdulillah, last week we had completed a significant portion of the poem. We had completed the rules of Noon, Sakina, and Tanween. We had completed the rule of Mim and Noon al-Mushaddadataini, and we had completed the rules of Mim as-Sakina. This week, insha'Allah Azza wa Jal, we're going to cover two more topics from the poem. The first of which will be the rules of al-Lam as-Sakina, which is verses 24 to 29, and then the rules of idgham for different types of letters, the rules of merging identical, similar, or related letters, which will cover verses 30 to 34 of the poem, bi'idhnillahi Azza wa Jal. So to start off our session today, we will first look at the rules of al-Lam as-Sakina. Now, inshallah, as we said before, all of the slides will be made available after the course, after the lesson, usually a day or so after. And inshallah, a recording will also be made available later in the week. To begin today's lesson, we will start off by talking about the rules of Lam Sakina, the rules of Lam with Sukoon. We had finished the rules of Noon with Sukoon, Mim with Sukoon. Now we'll go on to rules of Lam with Sukoon. And the first thing that Sheikh Sulaiman al-Jamzuri says in his poem when he's talking about Lam is the Lam that is attached to the beginning of nouns. So let's take a look at what this Lam is. The first type of Lam he talks about is referred to as al-Ta'rif. Al-Ta'rif. This particle in Arabic is a prefix that is attached to the beginning of Arabic nouns and only nouns. Right? It's composed of two letters, Hamzat al-Wasli, which has a fatha on the top, and then Lam with Sukoon. And this prefix in Arabic is used to define nouns. It makes a noun that is undefined become definite. So if I say kitabun, that just means a book. But if I add al to the beginning, it now becomes the book, al-kitab. It's a defined noun at this point. And the reason why we talk about al at the beginning of nouns is because depending on the letter that comes after it, meaning what the first letter in the noun is, that will determine whether I pronounce the lam clearly or if I merge it into the next letter. And so the 28 of the 29 Arabic letters, we don't include alif because it cannot appear after al. 28 of the Arabic letters, we take them and we divide them into two groups of 14. So if the al is followed by one of the 14 sun letters, that's the first group, or one of the groups. If the al is followed by one of these 14 sun letters, I'm going to merge it into the letter. I'm going to merge the al into this letter. Right? We call these sun letters al-huruf ash-shamsiyya. And if the al is followed by one of the 14 moon letters called al-huruf al-qamariyya, then idhar will be performed. I will pronounce the al clearly when I attach it to the beginning of this noun. So let's look at the first few lines from the poem that Sheikh Sulaiman al-Jamzuri says concerning this topic. He says, حكم لام ال ولام الفعل, the rule of lam in the particle al, and then later on we're going to look at lam al-fi'l, the lam that appears in a verb. So verse 24 of the poem, the Shaykh says, للام الحالان قبل الأحرف أولاهما إظهارها فالتعريف. He says the lam al, the lam in the particle al has two cases, halani, قبل الأحرف, before the letters in Arabic, meaning depending on what the letter that comes after it is. The first of these cases, أولاهما إظهارها. The first case we're going to talk about or discuss is إظهار, when I pronounce the lam clearly, فلتعرفي. So know this. قبل أربع مع عشرة خذ علمه. He says, if the lam appears before أربع مع عشرة, 4 and 10 gives us 14. If the lam appears before one of these 14 letters, خذ علمه, min, take knowledge or know what these 14 letters are from this phrase. ابغي حجك وخف عقيمه. This phrase means desire a good hajj or seek out a hajj and beware of it being barren or worthless, meaning don't ruin your hajj with evil deeds, right? So all of these letters in this sentence, Hamza, Ba, Ghain, Ha, Jim, Kaf, Waw, Kha, Fa, Ain, Qaf, Ya, Mim, Ha, these 14 letters are called al-huruf al-qamariyya, meaning if they're the first letter in a noun and I attach al to that noun, I'm going to do izhar. I'm going to pronounce the al clearly. Then the Shaykh says, after he described the first case for lam at-ta'rif or al at-ta'rif, verse 26, he says, ثانيهما إدغامها في أرباع وعشرة أيضا ورمزها فاعي. He says the second case for doing or the second scenario that al will appear in, or the second rule, is idgham, when I'm going to merge the al into the letter that comes after it. في أربع وعشرة أيضا, also before 4 and 10, before 14 letters. ورمزها فعي, he says the symbols or the letters, he's going to state them, so take them or learn them or memorize them, فعي. And each letter at the beginning of every word in this sentence is one of the letters of ash-shamsiyya. So what's the phrase he gives us? طب ثم صل رحما تفز ضف ذا نعم دع سوء ظن زر شريفا للكرم. Here he gives us this phrase that means طب, be good, ثم صل رحما, then enjoy the ties of kinship, تفوز, you will win if you do that, ضف ذا نعم, bring a guest or have as a guest someone who is a bountiful or as a blessed person, دع سوء ظن, leave evil thought, زر شريفا للكرم, visit an honorable person to yourself so that you can be honored as well. He's telling you, look at the first letter of every word. طا, ثا, صاد, را, تا, ضاد, ذال, نون, دال, سين, ظا, زاي, شين, لام. These are 14 letters that are called al-huruf ash-shamsiyya, meaning if they're the first letter in the noun and I attach al to the noun, I'm going to do idgham. And then he says, here's the names for them, verse 28, وَاللَّامَ اللُّولَى سَمِّيهَا قَمْرِيَّةً. The first lam we talked about with idhar, call this lam lam al-qamariyya. وَاللَّامَ الْأُخْرَى سَمِّيهَا شَمْسِيَّةً. And the second lam that we talked about, where we're doing idgham, call this lam lam shamsiyya. So here we can look at lam al-qamariyya, the first one he says, where he says, look for these 14 letters, ibghi hajjaka wa khaf aqimahu. And here we have 4 examples. Al-jibal, there's a jim after the lam, and here is the jim here. Al-Qamar, there's a qaf after the lam here. Al-Ard, there's a hamza after the lam. Al-Hajj, there's a ha after the lam. And in all these cases, I'm going to pronounce the lam clearly when saying the word. Then we look at examples of al-huruf al-shamsiyya, and the reason why we merge these letters or merge the lam into these letters is because they're close to the lam, and it's easier because when you speak Arabic, you would say these words a lot, so it's easier to just merge the lam into this letter or into these letters while speaking. So here's an example, wash-shams, or if I took off the waw, I would just say ash-shams. And this alif at the beginning will always have fatha, never anything else. Ash-shamsu. Here we see the sheen over here, one of the 14 shamsiyya letters. As-sama, ad-da'i, al-layl. Right? So in all these cases, I am not pronouncing the lam clearly. I am merging it into the next letter, and then the next letter gets shadda because it has become two letters, right? One with sukoon, one with haraka on it. And then after the Shaykh finishes talking about al-ta'rif and its two cases, whether it's Qamariya or Shamsiya, he then ends off this chapter by talking about the lam that has sukoon that appears in verbs. So he says, verse 28, وَأَظْهِرَنَّ لَامَ فِعْلٍ مُطْلَقًا, and say clearly the lam that appears in a verb, mutlaqan, in general, meaning read this lam with idhar in general. And we'll talk about the exceptions that appear. So he gives you some examples where you're supposed to pronounce the lam clearly. He says, في نحو قل نعم وقلنا والتقى. So here he gives you the example of the word قل نعم. Here I have a lam with sukoon, it's in a verb, and the next word is na'am. Pronounce the L clearly, there's no reason to do idgham here. The other example he says, وَقُلْنَا. I have the word again, قُل, there's a noon after it. Pronounce the lam clearly. Don't say قُلْنَا, قُل, قُلْنَا. Pronounce the lam clearly. And then the last one is a verb with lam at the beginning, وَالْتَقَى, or if I took off the waw, it's إِلْتَقَى. Right, to meet something. Iltaqa. Even though this ta is a harf shamsiyya, right? If I say, for example, taqwa becomes at-taqwa. In this case, because this is not lam at-ta'rif, it's a lam for a verb, I'm going to pronounce the lam clearly as waltaqa or iltaqa. So we say the lam al-fi'al that he talks about, that Shaykh Sulaiman mentions when he says وَأَظْهِرَنَّ لَامَ فِعْلٍ مُطْلَقًا. It's an original lam that appears in Arabic verbs. But remember he said mutlaqan, in general you will do idhar, but there are exceptions. And the exception is that if the al comes before another lam or before a ra in the next word, meaning if the word right after the lam, the first letter is a lam or is a ra, then I'm going to do idgham. I'm not going to say the al clearly. Otherwise, all of the other Arabic letters, if they appear before al, I will pronounce it clearly with idhar. So let's look at some examples. On the right hand side, we have examples of idhar. أرسلنا يلعبون قل أروني وتوكل على الله. And then on this side, we have examples of idgham, where Allah says, Alam aqul lakum. Alam aqul, right? This lam got merged into this lam, and they became one lam with shadda. Alam aqul lakum. Same thing here, yaj'al lakum, one lam with shadda. And here's the most important example. Here I have the word qul, and then the word rabbi. The letter after the lam is a ra. And because it's very close to the lam, it's difficult to pronounce the al clearly or pronounce the lam clearly. So instead of saying qul rabbi, I say qur rabbi, qur rabbi. I merge the lam into the ra and it becomes one ra with shadda. Qur rabbi. So even though this is a lam in a verb, the rule of idghar does not apply because the ra is one of the letters that lam with idgham applies to. And then the last example, قُلْ لِعِبَادِي, again merging lam into lam to create one lam with shadda. طيب, so here is just a summary of all the lam sakina rules that were mentioned. In short, we can say that lam with sukoon in the Quran, wherever it appears, only has two rules, either idghar or idgham. If the lam is followed by a lam or ra in the next word, idgham will always be performed. And if it's followed by any of the remaining letters, then we're always going to do idghar. There are some exceptions for different qira'at other than Asim, other than Hafs and Asim that we read in, where they have slightly different rules, but we're not going to go into the details of that in this class. And then the exception to this general rule for lam is al-ta'rif, the al of definition, the prefix attached to the beginning of nouns. It will be read with idgham for the 14 sun letters, and it will be read with idghar for the 14 moon letters. طيب, and that concludes the chapter of lam sakina. So lam only has two rules, either idghar or idgham. The next chapter, inshallah, we said we're going to look at, so we've finished 4 so far. The next one is the rules of idgham. This is from verses 30 to 34. And what we mean by idgham here is merging letters that are similar or letters that are close to each other, as we'll see in a bit. And there's going to be 3 categories we look at: identical letters, similar letters, and related letters. So the Sheikh starts off by saying, Babun fil mithlayn wal mutaqaribayn wal mutajanisayn, meaning this is a chapter concerning letters that are either identical, mithlayn, or mutaqaribayn, related, or mutajanisayn, similar. So he begins with verse 30 and says, In fi as-sifati wal makharij ittafaq حرفان فالمثلان فيهما أحق. He says, if the sifat and the makharij, meaning if the characteristics and the point of articulation are of 2 letters agree, ittafaq harfan, right? 2 letters agree in both their sifat and their makharij, call this type of relationship when they meet al-mithlani, fal-mithlani fihima ahaq. Yani the correct, the most right thing to call them is harfan, mithlan or mutamathilan, right? Al-harfan al-mutamathilan. That's category 1. Category 2 now he says, وَإِن يَكُونَا مَخْرَجًا تَقَارَبًا. But if they don't have the same makhraj, but their makhraj is close to each other, the point of articulation is close to each other, وَفِي الصِّفَاتِ اخْتَلَفًا, and their characteristics are different, يُلَقَّبَا مُتَقَارِبَيْنِ. We're going to call these 2 types of letters that meet, that have close makhraj and different sifat, متقاربين, الحرفان المتقاربان, 2 letters that are related to each other because they have a different place they come out from and they have different characteristics, but they're somewhat close to each other. Consider them cousins, right? And then he gives us the 3rd category, أو يكون اتفقا في مخرج دون الصفات حقيقا, or perhaps they agree in the makhraj, similar to the mithlani, but their sifat are different. They have the same makhraj, but different sifat, different characteristics, right? What do we call these 2 types of letters when they meet? Bil mutajanisaini. We call them al-harfan al-mutajanisan. Yani it's different to translate it, but I will translate it as similar letters. So mithlan, same sifat, same makhraj, identical. Mutaqariban, different makhraj, different sifat, they're related to each other. And then متجانسين, same makhraj, but different صفات. So here's a summary of this. Identical letters, al-mutamathilaini, they have the same makhraj and صفات. So it's the same letter twice. Two tas, two kafs, two qafs, two lams, two memes. Yani the same letter appearing twice. Then we have similar letters, al-mutajanisaini. They have the same makhraj but different صفات, different characteristics. And then finally we have related letters, al-mutaqaribaini. Al-mutaqaribain have different makhraj, different point of articulation, and different صفات as well, but they are close to each other, as we'll see in a little bit. Then after mentioning the three categories of relationships between letters, whether they're identical, similar, or related, he then tells us that there's another thing we need to take into consideration when two letters meet. He says, ثُمَّ إِنْ سَكَنَ أَوَّلُ كُلٍّ فَالصَّغِيرَ سَمِّيًا. If the first letter in the relationship, when two letters meet, whether they're متماثلين or متجانسين or متقاربين, if the first letter has sukun and the next letter has a haraka, فَالصَّغِيرَ سَمِّيًا, call this type of relation or this type of merging صغير. We're going to call this type of merging إدغام صغير, right? When the first letter has sukun and the second letter has a haraka on it. And he gives us another case, أو حرك الحرفان في كل فقل كل كبير وافهمنه بالمثل. Or if both letters in the relationship have a haraka, أو حرك الحرفان في كل, if both letters in the relationship have a haraka, يعني two dhammas or fatha dhamma or kasra dhamma, يعني any combination. The point is they both have a haraka on them. Call this type of merging or this relationship, فقل, say, كل كبير, call this one كبير, إدغام كبير, right? وَافْهَمَنْهُ بِالْمُثُلِ, and understand what this is with the examples. And the Shaykh says use examples, so we're going to take examples inshallah. So again, just a summary, little merging, al-idgham as-saghir, and this applies to all three categories, whether it's identical letters, similar letters, or related letters. The first letter in the relationship is sakin, meaning it has sukun, and the second letter is mutaharrik. Now, and all of the qurra agree that you're supposed to do idgham here. The second type of merging is called big merging, al-idgham al-kabir. You can call this minor and major if you want as well, and just terminology. And this is where both letters are mutaharrik. Both letters have a haraka on them. But the thing to note about idgham al-kabir, it does not apply to all reciters. Only some qurra out of the 10 qira'at, only some of them employ this type of merging regularly. And amongst the 10 qurra, specifically in the kubra recitations, al-qira'at al-ashr al-kubra, the only two imams who utilize this type of merging are Abu Amr and Ya'qub as part of their usul. And then sometimes other imams, such as Imam Hamza, might join in as well and do idgham kabir, but it's not part of his usul. It's not part of his regular rules that he does, right? But for us in qira of Hafs and Asim in Tariq al-Shatibiyya, that the majority of Muslims read in, we do not have this in our recitation. We do not have big merging, as we'll see in a little bit. But all of the qura agree on this type of merging, which is little merging, and in the different forms that it appears in, when the first letter has sukun and the second letter has a haraka. So let's look at examples for each type of relationship. So first we'll look at idgham al-mutamathilain, merging identical letters. Right, so we have two letters, kaf and kaf, the same letter twice, identical. One has sukun, next one has dhamma, becomes one letter with shadda. The two letters are merged together into one letter with shadda. Right? So here's an example of idgham saghir for mutamathilain, for identical letters. If I have the word yudrikkum, aynama takunu yudrikkum, I have a kaf with sukun, and after it is another kaf with dhamma. what's going to happen? I'm going to merge this kaf into this kaf and create one kaf with shadda. All right, so it's going to become yudrikkum becomes yudrikkum, yudrikkum. See, I jump over this kaf and I just go to this kaf with shadda. It has become one kaf with shadda. أينما تكونوا يدرككم الموت. Right, that's what idgham saghir for mutamathilin looks like. And then here is an example of idgham kabir, and this is one of the rare cases where it applies to all of the qurra. All 10 of the qiraat do this type of merging. This is the famous word in Surah Yusuf in the ayah, قالوا يا أبانا ما لك لا تأمننا, ما لك لا تأمننا. So there's two noons, but all of the qurra agree to merge them together. They both have haraka, dhamma, fatha, right? Remember we said idgham kabir is for when they both have haraka. So it becomes ما لك لا تأمنا, تأمنا, one noon with shadda. I took the first noon and I merged it into the second one. And we keep the haraka always of the second letter. We don't care about the haraka of the first letter, whatever it is. Right? And of course, in the Quran, you have to recite this word with either ishmam, where you purse your lips, or with rawm, where you read or you can read it with rawm, where you read the noon quickly. You say, ma laka la ta'manuna ala Yusuf, ta'manuna ala Yusuf. You don't pronounce the dhamma clearly, you read it quickly with ikhtilas, right? And some qurra read it without ishmam and without rawm, such as Abu Ja'far. But the point to remember is that we're merging two noons to create one noon with shadda. طيب, here's some more examples. We have the word قد دخلوا becomes وقد دخلوا, one dal with shadda. بلا becomes بلا with shadda. Same thing we talked about. يدرككم becomes one kaf with shadda. يكرههن becomes one ha with shadda. يكرههن. Right? In all these cases, I have identical letters that I'm merging together into one letter with shadda. Here's an example of idgham kabir. If you search up the mushaf for Susi from the Medina printing, you can find it on the King Fahd Quran Complex website. There are a number of mushafs available. So here, if we have a look at the ayah, when Allah Azza wa Jalla says, من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ. There should be dhamma on top of this noon, but some qurra, not hafs, but this is the Mus'haf of Susi we're looking at, he will merge this noon into this noon. He will do idgham kabir, so it becomes وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ. Now, so these, what we looked at just now was examples of idgham for identical letters. Here's another example. فَوَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ. If you read with idgham kabir, like Imam Susi does here, he would say al-kitab bi-aydihim, al-kitab bi-aydihim. The ba with fatha, al-kitaba, got merged into the second ba. It became one ba with shadda. Al-kitab bi-aydihim. طيب, now that we're done with mutamathilayn, we go on to the second category Imam Sulaiman al-Jamzuri talked about, which is al-mutaqaribayn, the related letters. So they come from different makhraj, different points of articulation, and they have different sifat, different characteristics, but they're close to each other in the mouth, mathalan, right? Or the sifat they share are close to each other. Now, so anyway, idgham al-mutaqaribayni, we say they're close to each other in either one or both of these aspects. Yani not necessarily they had to be close in makhraj, maybe they're just close in sifat. So let's look at some examples. Let's look at idgham saghir. Right, so idgham saghir, alam nakhluqkum, alam nakhluqkum. Qaf is meeting kaf. What happens? It gets merged into the kaf because it's similar to it, it's close to it. So it becomes alam nakhluq, look. I jump over the qaf. I've merged it into the kaf. It becomes kaf with shadda. Alam nakhluqkum min ma'in mahin. An example of al-idgham al-kabir, for those who read it idgham kabir in Surah Fajr مثلا, هل في ذلك قسم, هل في ذلك قسم. Kaf and Qaf are meeting, they're close to each other. This is idgham kabir, they both have haraka. It becomes هل في ذلك قسم, هل في ذلك قسم. I've merged the kaf into the qaf. It becomes qaf with shadda. Here's an example that applies to all of the qurra. We looked at this earlier. We say lam plus ra. They're close to each other. They're mutaqaribayni. This is idgham saghir. Qur rabbi, right? Qul rabbi becomes qur rabbi. And again, the example we just looked at in Surah Mursalat, alam nakhluqkum, merging the qaf into the kaf. An example that doesn't appear in Hafs, which is merging dal into sin. See, the makhraj doesn't have to be closed. Maybe it's just the sifat that are closed, for example. So what happens here, instead of saying qad sami', some qurra will say, okay, these letters are close, and they will say qas sami'. Qas sami'a Allahu. They will merge the dal into the sin. Qas sami'a Allahu. But this doesn't apply to Hafs. Another example of idgham, or two examples of idgham kabir, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ becomes وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ قَالَ رَبُّكَ. Merge the lam into the ra. Here وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ قَالَ becomes وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ قَالَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ قَالَ. Right. And again, inshallah, I'll share the link for the Susi Mus'haf. You can go over that on your own time to find more examples. The final category we talked about was idgham al-mutajanisayn, to merge the similar letters. We said mutajanisayn means they come from the same point of articulation. They come from the same makhraj, but they have different characteristics, different sifat. And the poem Tuhfat al-Atfaal does not talk about makharij and sifat the way al-Jazary does. So he's assuming you already know what they are. But even then, it's not that important, because you can kind of tell when you pronounce a letter how it sounds, whether it's close to another letter or not. Like kaf and qaf, just from sound alone, you know they're very close to each other in the mouth. So an example of merging two similar or two mutajanisaini letters is a famous example of Surah Kafirun. ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ما عبدتم. I have dal with sukun meeting ta. They come from the same makhraj. Dal and ta come from the same makhraj, but they have different characteristics. So what happens, I merge them into one ta with shadda. It becomes ma عبدتم ما عبدتم. Right, I've merged it, the dal into the ta. And then here's an example of idgham kabir. I have bayyata ta'ifa. Bayyata ta'ifa becomes bayyat ta'ifa. Bayyat ta'ifa. I've merged the ta into the ta, creating a ta with shadda. طيب, with regards to Hafs from Ash-Shatibiyya, there are 7 pairs of mutajanisayn letters that appear in the Quran for him. Ta plus dal, and then dal plus ta, ta plus ta, and then ta plus ta, but only partially, as we'll see just now. Tha plus dal, and then dal plus dha, and finally ba plus mim. And again, read these right to left, meaning this will be the first letter in the relationship, this will be the second letter in the relationship. So here are some examples. إذ ظلمتم becomes إذ ظلمتم, ذال into ظا. قد تبين becomes قد تبين. أثقلت دعوة becomes أثقلت دعة. أثقلت دعة. فآمنت طائفة becomes فآمنت طائفة. يلهث ذلك becomes يلهث ذلك. يلهث ذلك. اركب معنا becomes اركم معنا. يا بني أو يا بني اركم معنا. Right, merge the ba into the mim. Then we said take note of the fact that when we're merging ta into ta, it's not complete. And that's because ta is so strong and so powerful, it cannot completely disappear into the ta. So the result is not idgham kamil, it's idgham naqis. So I still keep some of the characteristics of the ta. So instead of saying ahadtu, I say ahaltu, ahaltu. I enter with a ta, I exit with a ta. Same thing here. Basatta, farrattum, farrattu. Right? Not complete idgham, but partial idgham. The fatness of the ta or the tafkhim of the ta remains, and then I exit with that skinny ta. Now, let's look at some examples of idgham kabir مثلا. Those were all idgham saghir we just looked at. So again, we said bayyata ta'ifa. This is for Susi again. He would say bayyat ta'ifa, merging the ta completely into the ta. Another example, he would say وَإِنَّمَا تُوَفَّوْنَ أُجُورَكُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ فَمَنْ زُحْزِحَ. There should be fatha here and then ayn. فَمَنْ زُحْزِحَ عَنِ النَّارِ becomes فَمَنْ زُحْزِعَ عَنِ النَّارِ. زُحْزِعَ عَنِ النَّارِ. I merge the ha into the ayn. They come from the same makhraj, the throat, but they have different sifat, different characteristics. So they are mutajanisayni, and this is idgham kabir again. So just another recap of the three categories. Letters, when they meet, are either going to be mutamathilain, identical, meaning the same letter appears twice. They have the same makhraj and same sifat. Or they will be mutajanisaini, they will have the same makhraj but different sifat. Or they will be related to each other. Mutaqaribaini, they will have a different makhraj and different sifat, but they will be close to each other, either close in makhraj or close in sifat, close in their characteristics. So let's just read the 5 verses of the poem one more time before we conclude. قال الشيخ إن في الصفات والمخارج اتفق. He says if the sifat and the makharij of a letter are in agreement, if they're the same, حرفان فالمثلان فيهما أحق. 2 letters are in agreement, call them mithlan. That's the most correct thing. Well, that's what they deserve to be called, al-mithlani or al-mutamathilaini or al-mithlaini. وَإِن يَكُونَا مَخْرَجًا تَقَارَبًا. And if their makhraj is not the same, but it's close, وَفِي الصِّفَاتِ اخْتَلَفَا يُلَقَّبًا. And their sifat are different, they will be called مُتَقَارِبَيْنِ, related or close to each other. أَوْ يَكُونَ اتَّفَقًا, or they agree فِي مَخْرَجٍ, in the makhraj, دون الصفات حقيقا, but they do not agree in sifat. Same makhraj, different sifat. حقيقا, يعني we will call these ones بالمتجانسين. We will call these 2 letters that meet متجانسين. Right, so those are the 3 categories. And then the 2 types of idgham we can perform are ثم إن سكن أول كل فالصغير سميا. If the first letter in the relationship already has sukoon on it, an original sukoon, right? Call this type of idgham صغير. سميا فالصغير سميا. Call it صغير. أو or حريك الحرفان في كل فقل. Or if both letters in the relationship have a haraka, whether it's the same haraka, ضمة ضمة فتحة فتحة كسرة كسرة, or فتحة ضمة ضمة فتحة كسرة فتحة, whatever it is. The point is they both have haraka on them. فقل, say or call this type of idgham كل كبير وافهمنه بالمثل. Call this idgham kabir and understand it from the examples. طيب, بفضل الله ورحمته, we have finished virtually more than half of the main body of the poem. We finished the rules of noon and tanween, the rules of noon and mim al-mushaddadataini, the rules of rules of mim as-sakina, the rules of al-lam as-sakina, And alhamdulillah, today we have finished the rules of Idgham al-Kabir up to verse 34 of the poem. So inshallah, next week, Saturday, the same time as usual, we will be entering into the chapter of Mad. That will be our second to last class next week. So we will take half of the chapter of Mad next week, and then the week after that week, which will be the last class of the course, we will take the second half of the rules of Mad and finish off the poem, insha'Allahu Azza wa Jal.